Good evening. My name is Claire Saxton with the Cancer Support Community. Welcome to our webinar, Frankly Speaking About Cancer, Clinical Trials, and the Cancer Moonshot, hosted by the Cancer Support Community. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, please dial 1-866-229-3239, option number 1. Before we start, I'll go over some reminders and housekeeping items. If you'd like to listen to today's presentation via telephone, please dial in using the conference line code you see on the screen. Today's call is being recorded and will be available on our website at www.cancersupportcommunity.org/webinars within the next week. The format of today's webinar will be as follows. The panelists will begin the discussion first, and then we will open the discussion up to the audience during the question and answer session. Thank you to those who submitted questions prior to the webinar as part of the registration form. If you would like to ask additional questions, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box on the right of your screen. You may submit a question at any time during the event. At the end of this webinar, you will be automatically redirected to the post-webinar survey. Please take a few minutes to complete this survey, as your input is of great value to us. I would now like to introduce the Cancer Support Community, which is the largest professionally led nonprofit network of cancer support worldwide. CSC is dedicated to ensuring that all people impacted by cancer are empowered by knowledge, strengthened by action, and sustained by community. We offer the highest quality social and emotional support through our affiliate network, as well as online or over the phone. On this screen, you'll see some of the resources we provide at the Cancer Support Community. The first one you'll see is the Cancer Support Helpline, which is staffed by licensed professional counselors who are available to assist you Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We also have our Open to Options program, which is a research-proven program that can help you prepare a list of questions to share with your doctor. We also have our Frankly Speaking About Cancer program, which is CSC's landmark education series that provides trusted information on a variety of topics important to people affected by cancer. Information is available through print and digital publications, online, and in person. I would like to introduce our Cancer Experience Registry, which is a unique project for people affected by cancer. People who have been diagnosed with cancer and those who help care for them can join the registry. You begin by answering survey questions. Your answers and those of others describe the experience of cancer patients and caregivers. This information is used to provide education and support resources that speak to patients, caregivers, and their needs. For more information or to join, visit www.cancerexperienceregistry.org. I would also like to take a moment to talk about our grassroots movement, which helps ensure that people touched by cancer have access to quality, comprehensive cancer care that includes social and emotional support. Again, if you would like to learn more about this program or to sign up, visit our main website at www.cancersupportcommunity.org. I would now like to introduce our panelists, Dr. Gerald Messerschmidt and Ide Mills. Dr. Messerschmidt serves as the director of the Clinical Research Center at the Lankenau Institute of Medical Research. He's worked with patients, researchers, medical centers, and pharmaceutical companies, and has had a long-standing special interest in immunotherapy. He brings great perspective because he has been involved in developing and conducting clinical trials for many years. Today, he's going to focus on the recently launched Cancer Moonshot and why that initiative actually increases the importance of enrolling more patients on clinical trials. Ide Mills is a lung cancer survivor who previously worked as an oncology social worker. She has been through chemotherapy and targeted therapy, as well as multiple clinical trials. She's handled the toughest times with resilience, resolve, perspective, and humor. Today, she advocates for people facing clinical trials, removing the stigma of lung cancer, and the cancer support community. We are thrilled that she has decided to share her experience and insight with us all today. I'm now going to ask Dr. Messerschmidt to talk to us about the recently launched Cancer Moonshot and why that initiative actually increases the importance of enrolling more patients on clinical trials. Dr. Messerschmidt?
Hello, everyone. I'm Gerald Messerschmidt. I'm a board-certified medical oncologist and hematologist. I just want to run through a few things to give you some ideas of how the cancer community through clinical trials is really trying to move things faster for patients. And the first part is the Moonshot Initiative. Some of you may have heard about this on the news. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the original development of this program last year. And then the program in many parts has been taken over now by the government. Joe Biden and the Office of the Vice President are actually the program leaders. But there are many other organizations, as you can see on this slide. Health and Human Services, the NIH, the Veterans Administration, and the Department of Defense are all government organizations. But part of this is to get other organizations talking with each other, including private drug companies, philanthropy efforts, and patient advocacy groups, so that we're all working together for a more seamless treatment and post-treatment of patients with cancer. Please go to the next one. One of the ideas of this is to really support not only basic research, but clinical research in several areas. And they're listed here, as you can see. There's been tremendous amount of progress in the immune therapy area. And now in cancer vaccines, there's been a lot of progress. I'm hoping for the first cancer vaccine to be approved next year, probably, I hope. But we're also working on detection programs. And most importantly is the second from the bottom there, what we call molecular profiling of the tumors and the surrounding cells. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why cancer is so difficult, because there's a lot of concern by patients, and rightfully so, that we've been fighting cancer for decades, it seems like. And are we really making progress? And the answer is yes. And in fact, I tend to say, when I went into oncology 35 years ago, I thought the cure was right around the corner. But I can tell you that now I am more optimistic than ever that we are just really going down the right path. And I'm going to show you what that path is, because the Cancer Moonshot is about this. I'm just going to give you a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So why is cancer so hard to kill? Since my picture's there, that's me giving a talk at the Cancer Support Community's presentation. When was that? Sometime in the spring, I think it was. No, it was in the early summer, because I just had my back surgery and was sitting on a stool giving this talk. But this is, you're going to hear in this program why cancer is so hard to kill and what we're doing to treat that. Next. This is a cancer cell that's dividing. And if look at this cell, it's got a bunch of lumps and bumps on their surfaces, and it's pulling towards the bottom left and the top right, and will form two cells. And that's one of the issues in cancer, is that cancer is constantly growing. Now, different cancers grow at different rates. They all have this characteristic that they grow constantly. So exact mechanisms of why they're growing constantly are being unraveled today. And many of these are known, but not all of them. And so we're working on these. So these things, these cells, express different items on their cell surface that you can see here. And that's how the immune system, and that's how many drugs can tell whether there's an abnormality inside the cell and whether they should kill the cell. Also, these cancer cells can put on their surface kind of fake signals and trick the immune system that they should not destroy this cell, that it's not a bad cell, and it's a masking of the tumor cells that leads to the immune system going, oh, okay, we don't need to kill you, when the truth is they do need to kill them. So part of the role of the future is to teach the immune system to kill these cells. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you a little bit about how this works. And what this is a thing called a clonal theory. And this has become understood over the last just few years when we've been doing genetic testing of different cancers in different patients over different amounts of time. And here you can see on the left, these purplish blue cells are the normal cells. And one of those normal cells can develop a mutation that in this turns it green, and this is the beginning of a cancer cell. It may not have the ability to spread throughout the body yet, but it's growing at an abnormal rate, and it's not normal. It's a cancer cell. Go to the next one. Here you can see that what happens, and this is what the problem is with cancer. Cancer does not have a brain. It doesn't think these things through, but it has a fantastic internal chemical system that allows these cells to grow and grow and grow and to mutate rapidly. And so here you can see the green cancer cells are actually pushing the normal cells out. And then one of these cells mutates to a brown cell. And so now there are two different clones. These are the green clone and the brown clone. And so the brown will have different characteristics than the green one does. May have some that are shared, but it'll have different ones from the green ones. Go to the next one, please. Here you can see that now the normal tissue, which you see that single blue cell, is now down, is being compressed by the tumor. And this is what the cancers do. They grow and grow and grow, and they push against the normal tissues, sometimes so hard that they can actually stop them from working. And that's how they mostly affect the patient. And here you can see both the green cells and the brown cells can again mutate to a purple cell. So there's a lot of changes going on in the genes, in the DNA of these cells on a regular basis. And these can provide these cells with three different characteristics. One is it makes no difference to the survival of the cell. Another one is that the change can actually make the cell die. If it's a change that is in a critical pathway to make energy within the cell will die. But every now and then it makes mutations that are survival enhancing. And that's the third, and that's the critical element. And these survival enhancing changes are what give the cancers the ability to continue to live and grow inside the human body. Next frame. And this is what happens is, in a tumor that you see that the brown cells are growing, the green cells are growing, the purple cells are growing. The purple cells have now mutated to a blue cell, a different kind of blue cell, and the brown cells have mutated to a gray cell, and they will then continue, all of these will continue growing. One of the challenges we have is that if you do a biopsy of a tumor like this, which is very characteristic of many cancers, so do the next click. It's missing. Let's say that the needle, the fine needle aspirate that you get done in interventional radiology or a fine needle biopsy may only hit just the green cells. And so when you look at that under the microscope or you send it for genetic testing, you may only know the genetic changes that are in one of these clones. And that's one of our biggest challenges in cancer today. And so when you see this on number 5, in this, the patient has been treated with an anti-green therapy based on the genetic changes that were found in that biopsy. But it doesn't affect the brown cells, the blue cells, the purple cells, or the gray cells, because they don't have the same genetic changes that the green cells have. And so the clones, so what you may see is actually a shrinkage of the cancer, but then you'll see some of these other clones then grow up, and that's called a recurrence. And that's one of the biggest issues that the moonshot is looking at, because there are different ways to be able to measure what kinds of genetic mutations are present in the whole body that are being developed in blood tests, not in biopsies, which are better for patients, though they're not quite as accurate as biopsies today, but they will be. And then there are immune treatments that could potentially treat. Go to the next slide. And here you can see kind of the analysis of how we're looking at cancer today with the Moonshot organization, but as also as scientists and physicians. And that is, in general, one drug treats one clone. Or what it really does is it treats one characteristic, one abnormal genetic characteristic will be treated by that one drug. So some of you will have been treated with one drug and then may have the tumor develop what some physicians will refer to as resistance, but it's not really resistance. It turns out in many cases that the drug has actually eliminated that clone, but the other clones are growing back. And so this second bullet is very important, that what we need is to treat and kill all the clones. And that's going to require not just one or two drugs, but many drugs. And these can be chemotherapy, this can be radiation therapy, it can be immune therapy, it can be targeted therapies. And hopefully soon, all of those there are approved products for all of those. And hopefully soon, anti-cancer vaccines will be a part of this that help focus the immune system on the actual cancer. The way the immune therapy stimulation is occurring in approved therapies today is that it's kind of jazzing up the entire immune system that does result in patient responses and prolonged survivals. And so it's really exciting therapy, but it's non-specific, so it has some side effects associated with it. And we think anti-cancer vaccines, when they become more available, will be able to kind of teach the immune system where to jazz up and where not to jazz up. And what's going to happen in the future is that the treatment of cancer will always be combinations, very rarely a single drug, and sometimes get up 8, 10, or 12 drugs to treat 8, 10, or 12 different clones that are potentially in the patient. And that's why cancer is so hard to cure, because we're just beginning to learn this. And then what we have to do is develop the testing to identify all these different clonal changes, and then develop drugs that treat those clonal changes. And you've seen some of these on television that have been approved that are very specific. And so we're moving in that direction, and the numbers in clinical trials is exploding. The numbers of new drugs that are specific against very specific cancer-associated genetic changes that give the clones the ability to survive. And that's what we're going to be treating in the future. Go to the next one, please. So why clinical trials? Well, clinical trials are the only way that we can get drugs onto the market, and will probably be that way for decades to come. There is no computer program that will predict whether a drug will work or not work in patients. That, I suppose, is possible, maybe 50 years from now, but right now, until that becomes available, clinical trials are the only way that we have to get these drugs available to our population. What's important is that today the knowledge is so much greater than it was even 5 to 10 years ago, let alone when I started 35 years ago, that the drugs that we're developing are so much better, so much more efficacious with less toxicity than the older drugs were, that bringing them to market is really one of our most important goals, because getting them available for patients. But what we also discovered is that, for example, I ran some clinical trials in the 2008, 2009, 2010 that was on a product that you may have not heard of. It's called ipilimumab, or the trade name that you may have heard of as Yervoy, was the very first immune therapy to come to market. And I can tell you that there are people alive today that were on that study with advanced melanoma and lung cancer. Those were the two that we started out studying, that are alive today because they took part in that clinical trial. And we're seeing that more and more with these more efficacious drugs, that those people that are able to take part in clinical trials can get exposure to these cutting-edge therapies earlier. And therefore, we're trying to move the clinical trials from the standard big cities even out to the suburbs and the more rural areas where there are oncologists that can, safely take part in the study and treat their patients. So there's a lot of emphasis to get more and more patients on clinical trials. Go to the next one, please. In the United States, only about 4% of patients with cancer ever are on a clinical trial. And that's not particularly bad right at the moment, because the cancer care in this country with standard therapy is excellent. What we want to do is to increase the number of patients from 4% to 6%, 10%, maybe even 20%, so that more patients are getting exposed to these newer drugs earlier than they would have before. So in that process, what is a clinical trial? And what a clinical trial in cancer is not a scary thing to me in talking with patients. Because what it really is usually to the right you see what we use now, or what the physicians call standard therapy, and the other side is the new therapy. And it's usually, or quite often, the standard therapy with a new therapy added on, so that patients are not ever really, that I can remember in a long time, ever given placebo or substandard treatment. They're given the standard treatment at a minimum, and then they may get the new treatment. So that's the way we try to make it to understand how the new treatment can improve upon the standard treatment. And that's the way probably over 90% of cancer clinical trials are done today. And so in the old days, I used to talk to patients, and they used to be concerned that they were going to be a guinea pig. And though they were never, ever really a guinea pig, because we were always very careful with what we did in the United States in clinical trials, the clinical trials nowadays are so much better and so much safer and so much a higher chance of having benefit for the patient that, I'm really a big advocate for clinical trials for patients. And many physicians are too. They just don't always have access. So giving them the access to these drugs is an important part of the moonshot. Next, please. We've already talked about this to a large extent. The number of people that take part in clinical trials has remained about 4%, but the cancer death rate with our advances is dropping, and that's what's important to us as physicians and to patients and their families, is that we're developing drugs that are keeping patients alive longer. Sometimes it's not a cure at this point in time. Sometimes it is a cure. But our goal is to increase the level of cures and the level of long survivors all the time. And what has happened is, as you can see, that since the 1990s, so about 25 years ago, the death rate has dropped by 18%. And so go to the next slide, please. And people that take part in these clinical trials often get these cutting-edge therapies earlier than the general population. And so being a part of a clinical trial today is really quite important to investigate. It's always the patient's decision whether they participate or not, but to get that kind of information is what's important. So that, and what that does is that allows us to do faster clinical trials so that they get done faster. Hopefully this also translates into being cheaper for the pharmaceutical companies developing it, and hopefully cheaper in the overall cost when it actually does come to market. My bet is it will not be cheaper, but what we'll have is a slower rise in the cost of these newer drugs. And in fact, I gave a talk earlier today to financial people about cancer, that the cost of cancer is not going to go down. But I think what we can do with the science and medicine as we're developing it now is slow the rate by making things occur faster and getting them to market faster. Go to the next one, please. So we presently have and some of you may have been in some of these clinical trials. 3 different phases. Phase 1 is usually the first time it goes into a human, and phase 2 is against a specific type of cancer or several specific types of cancer. And phase 3 is to get approval of the drug to go onto the market. Well, these phases in general take over 5 years, 5 to 10 years of clinical trials for one drug to get to the market. And so many of us have talked about this in the Moonshot, that getting this streamlined is really important. And so what we see now is that we often move from phase 1 to phase 2 in one fell swoop. So we may, and phase 2 may lead to approval. And the FDA, so you may hear things about it, is actually a fantastic organization, particularly dealing with cancer, has worked very closely with the physicians and the pharmaceutical companies to also streamline approval. And so I work on clinical trials all the time, and what I see is many clinical trials getting done in phase 2 and allowing for approval of the drug at phase 2. And so it's what we see is that the timeline of first in going into a human to the time that it's available for general marketing is down around 2 to 3 years instead of 5 to 10 years. We do still have larger trials to demonstrate that the phase 2 results were accurate. We call those confirmatory trials, but those are done after the drug is available to the patients and in that patient population. So it really is bringing drugs faster to market, and our goal is to even get it faster than that. Go to the next slide, please. This is what we measure. So for accelerated approval, we often measure towards the bottom of this, complete remission rate or overall remission rate. For approval, for the confirmatory studies, we often go to progression-free survival or overall survival. Overall survival is our goal. Overall survival is having people live longer and surviving longer. Hopefully, in some of those, if not a majority of those patients, it will translate into a cure. But right now, we just measure overall survival. We don't use the cure word a lot until we have a lot of information to really suggest it. However, as I mentioned, some of those people that went on the Your Voice studies now close to 8 years ago, still being alive with a median survival of perhaps 6 months, that's a good overall survival rate. And we see similar programs with what some of you have seen on the TV with Opdivo and Keytruda. These are other immune therapies that are come on the market that also have people living much longer than they did before with very significant cancer when they come on to these clinical trials. And now they're approved and they're moving, to the much larger population. Next one, please. So now maybe searching for clinical trials, you can use the cancer support community to help you with this. And communication with your oncologist is really important. And now oncologists are usually keyed to taking care of the patient with the least amount of toxicity and the least amount of disruption to their life. And so one of our goals in the Moonshot program is to get more and more of these experimental drugs available to more and more community oncologists who in this country are frankly excellent, and that's the major goal. That's a major goal, so that we can get more patients outside of the major medical centers within, the big cities, so that people don't have to drive or travel as far, and they can get it from a physician that they trust. And so communication with your doctor is really key about what you should do as your next steps. But you can also learn a lot from going on the web. If we go to the next slide. Some people are concerned with cost, but clinical trials for patients in general have no cost for the patient. Now, there are some caveats to that. The insurance, visit copays still have to be paid, but the insurance companies either cover the visits so that you're not having to pay for those, and the drugs are either paid for because they're standard therapy by your insurance company, or they're covered by the company on the experimental side because they're given to the physician's site to give free to the patients that enter the trial. So in general, there's not cost for the joining the clinical trials in most ways. But you do need to keep in mind that there are some other issues. You may actually, one of the things that we are very clear on is that when people are in clinical trials, they actually see the doctor and the nurses in the clinic more frequently than they do when they're not on clinical trials. And so if you have to pay for parking, that could go up. But even some clinical trials will help some patients with cost issues in paying for travel or parking or those types of things. So in general, I feel pretty comfortable that most clinical trials do not cost patients really anything. And they actually end up getting really better care because they're seen more often. Next slide. This is always a question that we brushed upon just a few minutes ago. Things that, there are significant regulations on clinical trials and how they're conducted and who can be involved in them. And I can tell you that this is all I do every day. I don't own any cancer drugs that are going into the marketplace. I'm very impartial, but I can tell you that clinical trials, if I got cancer, which could happen to me at any time or anybody else, I would go on clinical trials because the people, the physicians that are involved in clinical trials, their nursing staff, and others on their staff that are involved in these clinical trials actually have to pass screening, to make sure that they are actually trained, and they have to maintain specific training on the regulations and clinical trial programs to continue to do clinical trials. And so in the United States and in most of Europe, clinical trials are actually really well done. And the rest of the world is actually catching up quite fast. But in the United States, they're done really well. They're done ethically. No one gets any money, no kickbacks for doing clinical trials or anything like that. There's, the clinical trials pay for the procedures that need to be paid for, the blood tests, those kinds of things. So it's really easy to participate in clinical trials. What it takes is, in today's world, usually, the patient and their caregivers to be directly involved in this. And so what usually happens is there's this form called the informed consent document that is given to the patient and someone who may be with them to take home and review with the family. And many families of cancer patients have younger either siblings or children that know how to get out on the internet, and they often explore and learn a lot of stuff. But the document that is given also is very detailed, sometimes overly detailed, about what all the clinical trial is about and what it means to the patient and those kinds, and what kind of possibilities of benefit, what kind of possibilities of any toxicities, and those kinds of things are really spelled out. And the final decision is the patient. And in today's world, they listen to their children, their spouse, their brothers and sisters, and the decision is made to either join or not join. Go to the next one. So I believe that clinical trials today actually increases the patient's hope to get a cutting-edge therapy. Now, not every patient in a clinical trial gets a cutting-edge therapy. Some of them just get the standard therapy. However, often there are what are called crossovers or access programs to the cutting-edge therapies following the clinical trial. And so this is an incentive for patients to join clinical trials, to get the newest and most innovative therapies. And I can tell you every day I see new drugs that are very exciting for patients. And of course, on a clinical trial, you do get extra care because the clinical trial always has specific monitoring issues. So patients often get their livers monitored and their lungs monitored and their hearts monitored, their kidneys monitored at a more frequent basis when they're on a clinical trial, because that's part of the data that's given to the FDA to get the drug approved. And so you see your physician, you see your nurses, you are asked about if there's been any problems or any concerns, much more on a clinical trial. And so if there are issues, you can voice them and people hear them. Not only hear them, they write them down, they put them into the computer system, and people are aware of them immediately. Go to the next one, please. So the future of clinical trials is actually rapidly coming. In the past, and even today, if there are patients on the line or family members, you know that people were diagnosed with breast cancer or lung cancer or liver cancer or colon cancer. These are organs in the body where the mutations first start. However, we're changing from that designation to more targeted designations. So, for example, you may have a lung cancer that has a specific mutation, but someone with colon cancer could also have that specific same mutation, and they may be treated with the same drugs because of that specific genetic mutation that was found in each one, rather than treated with the standard organ therapy. And actually, I will talk a little bit about that, because she's had that experience. And so the future is really moving to be more individual patient specific. We call it personalized medicine or precision medicine, where we're doing tests like genomic testing, and there are other tests that are coming that will profile each individual patient on what are the actual mutations in all of their cancer clones, not just the one that gets biopsied, but hopefully all of them, and then treat them with 2, 8, 10, 12 drugs, whatever it takes, to try to treat all the clones, no matter what organ they actually started with, more based on the scientific knowledge of what mutations are in those cancers that are making those cells grow and survive. Next one. So now I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Ide, who has a much better picture and looks much better than I do. And so, Ide, you want to take over?
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. So let me tell you a little bit of my history so that you understand where I interacted with clinical trials. I was diagnosed in February of 2011. Actually, I was diagnosed on Valentine's Day. And at that time, they were trying to figure out, did I have metastatic breast disease that went to the lung or metastatic lung disease that went to the breast? Thankfully, upon further research or testing, really, they learned that I had metastatic lung disease and that what they saw in the breast wasn't anything, thank goodness. But at that time, they knew I had non-small cell lung cancer, but they had to do more testing to determine if the cancer itself had any mutations that Dr. Messerschmidt has begun to talk about to all of you. And so while waiting, at that time it would take a good 15 days or 2 weeks to get the test back. And so I didn't need to be treated at that moment. I could wait that time. However, because that was going to be critical to determine the type of treatment, when they got the results back, they learned I didn't have the common mutation, if you will, called EGFR, but they didn't know what I did have. So we decided I would go on conventional therapy at that time. And conventional therapy was 3 drugs. Now, I also tell you here that I'm an oncology social worker and that I'm a health educator. And I say that because I had background in the field and knowledge, and that helped. It helped tremendously. And I say that to recommend to all of you that if you don't have this experience, and not everybody does, that you seek out whoever can help you learn about the cancer. I mean, I think you can't know enough. And as we said at the beginning, the people like those at the cancer support community really can help through many of their programs to guide you to learn more about the disease. So when I was diagnosed, I think what I'm going to tell you is going to reinforce what Dr. Messerschmidt has said, because when I was diagnosed, there were 3 drugs let me say that there were 3 drugs that are available today that were not approved and on the market 5 years ago. And that does speak to clinical trials being getting drugs to market in a much quicker pace. So the fact that non-small cell lung cancer has, they've learned, several different mutations, but not all of the cancer mutations have a drug to treat it or 2 drugs to treat it. Some don't have any drugs to treat it. And the research to understand more about the mutations and to understand and learn which drugs treat it are critically important, critically important. So at the time, I went on standard IV chemotherapy. I received 3 drugs, and really also because of a prior trial, they learned that those 3 drugs, if once I got to a remission or response, not really a remission, a response from the original chemotherapy, and I went through the standard 6 cycles, I then went on maintenance therapy. Now, maintenance therapy at that time, just wording-wise, that was novel, and many people didn't actually get more chemo after they finished the first 6 cycles or approximately 6 months of treatment. They just sort of stopped. And so it was through a clinical trial that they learned that maintenance chemotherapy was really very important. And it really, in my case, made a significant difference. And I stayed on treatment until that same treatment until 2.5 years afterwards. When I progressed with more disease, I had the option to then go on the drug that was approved during that time, which was crizotinib, and it is an oral targeted drug that is specific to ALK-positive patients. They later learned from additional clinical trials that it's also a drug that treats another very rare type of lung cancer or mutation in non-small lung cells. So if you were ROS1 positive, it's now being used for that. But it's only through clinical trials that they have learned of this information and are beginning to treat non-small cell lung cancer as many cancers, as not just one cancer, but is as many different types. Next slide. So I had to face the idea of a trial in, like I said, in July of 2013, so 2.5 years later. Now, at that time, I could go on crizotinib or I could go on a clinical trial. So I did my research, and I have a lot of discussions with my oncologists. I had 2 oncologists at the time, and had really a very good relationship with both of them, that I brought the trials to them, they brought the trial information to me, and we really talked about whether I should go on it or not. And just like Dr. Messerschmidt said, it was to receive crizotinib with an unknown drug. So it wasn't to have just an unknown drug. For me, it was, do I want crizotinib or do I want an unknown drug? And at that time, it was to learn the safety and of the dose of this class of drugs called heat shock proteins. And I decided that I would try it. It was local in that I only had to go from where I was living to my doctor, who was, an hour away, so local. It wasn't like I was traveling far for this treatment. And it was it's an oral treatment. But as Dr. Messerschmidt said, I got a lot of care and a lot of follow-up. Oh, so the heat shock protein, though, was IV. So in this other hospital, I was followed by, it was a new treatment team in that I had new IV nurses and whatnot. But I was also followed by a research nurse and then the IV nurses who were giving me the drug. So on the one hand, I had to meet new nurses than the nurses I was getting at the very local hospital. But it just meant more care. And the side effects I had were not physical ones. They were lab-related drugs. But it ended up in only a short 2 months that my lab values were elevated and I had to come off the trial. But that's not a bad story, really. It's just, to me, it was very close monitoring that I received, and that because this drug was causing my lab values to be elevated, I certainly didn't want anything that was going to be a problem. Next slide. Oh, my computer went. There we go. Hold on. Okay. So I went another 9 months on just crizotinib, and in May of 2014, yet again, the disease progressed. And I then had brain metastases. I wasn't symptomatic, but they did show up on MRI. So at that time, we changed the treatment to a drug that was approved. Ceritinib was approved. It was the next drug approved for ALK positive. So I went on that drug. Also, my oncologist and I were talking about, well, but what about clinical trials? Were there any clinical trials to consider? And so we looked at the trials. We knew what was down the road for me, what drugs were being explored, and that was always not necessarily an option because they weren't an option right at that time, but it was important for me to know and have a sense of what drugs are being studied where, and have as much information as possible. So I always knew I could have this conversation and be up to date with my doctors. So a lot of information I got online from places like the Cancer Support Community or lung-specific organizations that were doing providing education or doing fundraising for research for lung cancer specifically. So as you see here on the slide, November of 2014, not much long after of the starting the ceritinib, I developed a really bad cough, lost a lot of weight, felt lousy, and one doctor was saying it was a lung infection, and another doctor thought, this is progressive disease. I don't have anything else for you. I think that really of all the trials, because there were several, of all the trials, I want you to go talk to my colleague in Massachusetts. I want you to go to talk to her about a trial she's conducting. We don't have it at our facility. We don't have the drug. We're going to get it soon, but we don't have it now. So it meant, what do I do? Now, in that case, it wasn't like, okay, I'll just take the same drug longer, or there was a drug available. There was no drug available for me. So I went up to Boston with my husband. We traveled up there, not a far trip, but in the middle of the winter. It's a cold trip when you're feeling lousy. And I learned about the trial and about the eligibility. As you see, it turned out I had an infection and I stayed on ceritinib, but not without more knowledge and more background. And that's really what I want to, impress upon you. Next slide. So then came the next trial. It happened, that was back in December 14, and then really just about a year from last year to now, just a year ago, I started developing symptoms and more brain metastases. And I figured at that time I'd probably, go on that trial. Who knew? And that I would have to go back to Boston. So I needed to get radiation locally. locally to my brain. I had it to my head. And then I would start on a new drug. So again, the research, again, the discussion. And although I was not seeing my local doctor as much, he remained then and still now in the picture. And so I think Dr. Messerschmidt sort of talked about how we're hoping to get more trials beyond the academic centers so that people can stay local with their treatment and stay with their oncologist so that they have relationships and trust. I was fortunate just in where I live that I could go to both places and be able to confer with and see a specialist just in lung cancer who conducts trials. So again, I had conversations with both of my doctors about the research, about what to do, and at that time, there were no new drugs. Now remember, I told you there were 3 new drugs, but in November, there were no new drugs. So alectinib, which is the 3rd drug to market, the 3rd drug approved by the FDA, was approved in December, a month later. And that's really what happened to me the first time when crizotinib got approved. But it got approved, and I was already on on the roll with standard treatment. So the drug alectinib was approved later in December. And brigatinib, I think, has applied for approval with the FDA, and that will be the 4th drug to get approval for this very specific treatment for this very specific mutation or mutations. I think crizotinib is also being used in neuroblastoma, which is a disease, a cancer that children may get. So my doctor applied for me, my doctor was putting me on lorlatinib. This was the trial that I was going to go on in Boston if it wasn't an infection. So I was all ready to travel to Boston if that's what I needed because I wanted treatment. By December of 2015, the trial was in New York, and I could just go locally to New York, and I wouldn't have to go to Boston. And at that point, switch doctors from my New York doctor to a Boston doctor. However, I was excluded because I have a lung infection. Had that lung infection the year before. But I'm receiving the drug via a compassionate plea. And I've been stable since, knock wood. I'm just laying it out to give you the background and say how things happen. That's the clinical course that I've been on. Oops, and is it? Can you go to the next slide? So, as Dr. Messerschmidt has said, drugs are being approved at a much more rapid rate. In the short time or long time that I've been diagnosed, 79 drugs have been approved for cancer, 12 drugs just in the last year. Now, those drugs may not be all new drugs, brand new, or new drugs to treat just cancer. The FDA approved new drugs, like, we've talked about, but they also have approved drugs for new indications. So, like Opdivo was approved for melanoma, then it got approved for lung cancer. Also, antiemetic medicine has been approved, and there's even been a blood test approved, and Dr. Messerschmidt mentioned blood testing to diagnose cancer. So things are happening rapidly. Next slide. So what clinical trials research, and I think Dr. Messerschmidt basically covered it, but I wanted to just point out that in addition to new cancers or combinations of treatments, it's also looking at sometimes how to treat with supportive care medicines, whether it's the bone strengthening medicines or antiemetics, or even supportive care and preventative care. So there are trials going on exercise and fatigue management, about dietary changes, and about counseling interventions. So there are clinical trials looking at everything from psychological and coping styles, as well as complementary treatments to your cancer care. And there's, as I mentioned, there is new diagnostic testing methods and new tests. And then the other thing to think about with clinical trials is just about preventing cancers and establishing screening protocols. So for me, with regard to lung cancer, I was not a smoker, but for those that do smoke, there was a very large trial done over the years that looked at lung cancer in diagnosing lung cancer in those who are at risk, and from those studies, they're able to establish screening protocols and also go to the insurance and government for reimbursement to get those tests done, not dissimilar to mammography, that kind of thing. But it's because people have contributed to the research. Next slide. So why do we enroll? Also, Dr. Messerschmidt covered this, but I think from my point of view, receiving the close monitoring, having really close follow-up with my nurses was really helpful. And there were times when my doctor was following up, asking and taking notes about what my side effects were, and really going over what the side effects were and what I was feeling, what I wasn't feeling, what was happening or not. And he would explain to me how it was used in a clinical trial. So I think it's important also to ask for follow-ups. Like I found out that the heat shock protein trial and other trials related to it, they found that it wasn't effective in lung cancer. So, good to know. And, you're participating in something and contributing to something that will hopefully find treatments for other people as well. So, I also feel very strongly about participating for my own health, but also to help others. Next slide. Myths and misconceptions. So go back to me saying that lung cancer, that I'm a social worker in oncology and a health educator. I should know, right? Well, you don't just know. And, clinical trials people would think clinical trials, and I thought, only for people who have no other treatment available to them. Well, that's just not true, And another myth, these are all myths, that phase 1 trials are only for people who have end-stage disease, and that's not true. Cancer clinical trials cost more than standard treatment. That also is not true, and Dr. Messerschmidt brought that out, but I wanted to say that I was doing some research and found that I think they did research at Hopkins and Sloan Kettering, Johns Hopkins and Memorial Sloan Kettering, both did studies that showed that the cost was really the same. So it's not like it's going to cost so much more. That the only place to get a clinical trial is if you live near a large academic hospital. That's not true. There are a lot of consortiums now and people working together, so helping to break down some of those challenges. and that after a consent form is signed, you have to stay enrolled in the trial. That is definitely not true. And that you never find out the results of a clinical trial that you participate in. And while that may have been in the past, that is not true, in that all you have to do is ask, and the trial results are public and made public to you. Next slide. So let's make an informed shared decision, right? So we have informed consents. They're very confusing, but what do you need to know to be informed yourself about clinical trials, and a shared decision because you really want to work with your doctors about what's best for you, right? So you need to do your research, whether it's through the Cancer Support Community's clinical trial program, whether it's on a government site. Many of the pharmaceutical companies now are listing their clinical trials. So you can, if you know the group of drugs that are usually used to treat your cancer, you can search that way by going to those companies. The advocacy organizations, so in addition to the Cancer Support Community, many advocacy organizations have focused help on that clinical trials and clinical trials for your type of disease. So for me, there are a few lung cancer specific organizations that are either supporting clinical trials or just have a litany of information and will help guide you. Reach out to them. And the other is online cancer communities. Now, you have to be very careful, and I honestly would say I'm not talking about going to, WebMD's support group, and I don't mean them per se, but like a general support group that has a cancer community, but cancer communities like Inspire or Patient Power or Grace, Cancer Grace. These are cancer online communities that don't have like a brick and mortar, and but have a wealth of information about trials. And then in order to make an informed decision, you have to learn, you have to get their status, you need updates on, where's that trial now. It's a very personal decision. So while it's medically is one aspect, but what's the travel commitment? What are your housing needs? Where do you stand financially? Because there are out-of-pocket expenses. A few slides back said it certainly cost me more money to be in the city and parking in the city than, having free parking 3 miles up the road from me at my cancer center. And what kind of a time commitment can you take out from work to do this, to be on a trial? In that if you have to travel or whatnot. So you need to think about that. You need to learn what support is available. So the cancer center that's running the trial may have help, financial help, reduced hotel stays at local facilities, different programs like that. So do the advocacy organizations or your own community. And then again, talk with your doctor. You got to talk to your doctor. And in addition to talking about the trial, you want to know about, what are your goals? What are you looking for? And what are your personal issues? And how does that impact your decision in making choosing to be on a trial? Next slide. And then I really want to close on a note of the Cancer Registry, because I feel very strongly about it. And to me, it feels like research, and it is research, and it is not one trial, but through the registry, you are registering your experience with a bona fide resource in the cancer support community, and your experience gets gathered together with others' experiences. And they then glean through the information anonymously. I mean, your personal data is stripped, but they learn from what you have shared and what you have experienced, whether it's about the cost of cancer or whether it's about coping with nausea and vomiting. But they look at a host of different issues that are gleaned from what I share and you share to help develop other programs, to identify the issues for which many organizations take advantage of the fact that their research has shown something, and then to look at how you can create a solution. And the cancer support community is, I think, novel in doing that. And really, I think it is worth going online, checking them out, whether you're the patient or the caregiver. It's really very helpful because you, again, like with a clinical trial, with a registry, you are helping others. And it can be very helpful just to share your own story. So I clearly believe wholeheartedly in the Cancer Registry and would suggest you check it out.
Thank you.
I guess that's the last slide, yeah.
So at this point, we would now like to open the discussion up to the audience. We may have answered some of your questions during the presentation. However, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to type them into the question and answer box on the right of your screen now. The first question that I'm going to ask, and I'll ask Dr. Messerschmidt to answer it first, is whether there's a risk in a phase 1 clinical trial of getting a toxic dose that turns out not to be safe.
That's a very important question. There are several types of drugs that's not an issue. So, for example, immune therapy, vaccines, those kinds of drugs often do not have a real toxicity that's associated with the dose. Chemotherapy drugs, so some of the older drugs, and there are some newer chemotherapy drugs coming out, are associated with some toxicities that are at the higher levels. And so it's worthwhile discussing with the physician or the nurse that you're talking with about the trial, what does that mean for you? I can tell you that very seldom are we surprised by toxicity in a clinical trial. It's usually known what that toxicity is going to be, even with chemotherapy. And the protocols are written in such a way and approved by the government because they're experimental, so the FDA has to allow the studies to go forward. And then there's a second thing called the Institutional Review Board that also must review the protocols. And these are all good things that happen. The physicians that write the protocol understand that, safety is an important issue. That doesn't mean that some patients won't have some toxicities, but in general, they're already anticipated and some kind of treatment or stopping the drug or other rules are already put into the protocol if someone were to have those. And so I can tell you that I've done hundreds, literally hundreds of clinical trials, and probably 35 or 40 phase 1 studies. And in the last 5 years, I can't remember a single study I had to call the FDA with because of an unexpected toxicity that we were concerned about. So the answer is yes, it's possible, but in today's world, the chances of it really being unexpected and really toxic is really quite small. So I don't know if that gave you any feeling of comfort, but I feel comfortable with doing phase 1 studies that I review and understand, what the mechanism of action is, what the potential toxicities are, what we're seeing in the animals. I look at all of that stuff, and then I make my decision if I think it's safe, and if not, I tell the company I think they need to do this or do something differently. And that's the way most people function in this world today.
Did you have anything to add to that, Ide?
I don't really. I mean, I was on a phase 1 study, and I don't think I was particularly concerned of any toxicity because the doctor really made it clear to me this is what the drug is expected to do, won't do, will do. I asked about it, but I don't think I was particularly concerned more than any other drug I would be taking.
Thanks. So the next question was actually given to us in the form of a statement, and it says, please emphasize that participants in a clinical trial do not have to stop conventional treatment if they are randomized not to get the experimental treatment. Dr. Messerschmidt, can you comment on, once again, on conventional treatment versus experimental treatment?
Yeah, so I talked about this early on during my part of the discussion, but to just bring it up again because it's a very important point, is that cancer is not a disease where physicians and pharmaceutical companies are interested in doing anything other than helping the patients. And so that has really resulted in a lot of everyone being concerned that patients are getting at a minimum standard therapy, and then some people or all the people on the trial, it depends on the trial design, can also get experimental therapy. Now, in some cases, there may not be standard treatment. There may only be some possible things that have been only tested, with maybe some interesting results, but not really agreed upon that it's anywhere near standard treatment. And in those cases, patients may get just an experimental rather than what the physician might give if the experimental treatment weren't there. But in many of those cases, that's not denying patients anything. In fact, usually, in my opinion, the experimental treatment often has a better chance of being effective, but it's just not proven yet.
Ide, do you have anything you want to add?
Not there. Thank you.
Great. And I have a very specific question here, and I'm going to broaden it because the person who asked wanted to know, is there a clinical trial for appendiceal cancer? And I'm going to broaden that question to ask, how do you find a clinical trial that's right for you?
So let me tell you, I saw this question earlier, so I've actually done a couple of things. Let me tell you that in the slides, we recommended that you go to www.cancersupportcommunity.org/clinical trials. And I have done that, and on my computer. I have to say that it's not straightforward. So, Claire, this needs to be made easier, I think, to find the clinical trials. But there's really good discussions of clinical trials and what they can mean and how to get to them. But if you click, so if you go to that page, the clinical trials page, there is one that says access to clinical trials. And if you click on that, you will be able to get a screen where you can put in some specific information about the type of cancer you would like to learn about. And so finding a clinical trial pops up. You can find the trial now. And in general, this is pretty easy. It says which trials interest you, and it says adults, children, or prevention. So if you have cancer of a certain type, you just click adults. Then it asks you for diagnosis. Now, one of the things is that in the original question, it asked about a very specific, very rare cancer, which is not on this list. And so, but if you click on any of them and then you go to the next step, you actually have to, in a way, join the network, and you put in your information, and then someone can help you find that information. And it's really very user-friendly at that point, because now you have someone right at Cancer Support Communities helping you find what you're looking for. On the other hand, you can look at another website, which is called www.clinicaltrials, all one word, .gov, G-O-V. This is a very important resource for patients and families, where cancer's involved. And although this is more than just a cancer website, a lot of it is cancer. And you just put in the type of cancer that you want, and it will tell you all the clinical trials, even very rare clinical trials. So, and this is actually a requirement by the U.S. government that anybody doing a clinical trial in the United States must, except for phase 1 studies, it's required that they must be on this web page. But many people even put phase 1 studies on these web pages. And the FDA has actually just put out a new rule about putting the results of these trials on the same site. So the amount of information that you'll be able to get in the future is quite user friendly. It can be made better, I think, and they're working on that. But if you have a specific rare tumor type, then you can look that up on there. And what you'll see, I looked up a very rare tumor type that's associated kind of with colon cancer. And what I found was 30-some clinical trials, some of which are completed, some of which are still recruiting, and some of which are still open, but they're not recruiting. So you have to pick those out and take a look at them. Some of them are in specific locations that may not, or may be right next door, and some of them may be in multiple institutions. So feel free to explore clinicaltrials.gov if you have very rare cancers. Otherwise, I would learn to use the Cancer Support Communities clinical trial program, because it's a little bit easier to do. And even with rare cancers, I would try to do that. And you're dealing with professional people, not just a computer in that situation. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you. Since it's now, we've come to the end of our time, I'm going to thank our participants for your enthusiasm and the questions that made today's webinar a success, and I would really love to thank our panelists. Dr. Messerschmidt and I have helped make this so informative. If you'd like more information, please visit CSC's website. You're also welcome to call our toll-free helpline, and a person can talk to you about your issues or even help you through the beginnings of finding a clinical trial. We also want to let you know about our upcoming October 18th webinar, Frankly Speaking About Cancer, Clinical Trials for Early-Stage Cancers. For information about this or any other webinar, visit www.cancersupportcommunity.org/webinars. CSC would also like to thank our program supporters, Amgen, Celgene, AstraZeneca, Karyopharm, Pfizer, and Novartis. Please take a moment to complete our webinar evaluation survey, which you will be automatically redirected to. We greatly appreciate any feedback you may have. Thanks again for your participation.